Welcome to Thueringer or Farming Simulator 15. We now continue in our reading of My Antonia by Willa Cather in Book 2, Part 7. He wore his teachers out. He could never learn like other people, never acquired any finish. He was always a Negro prodigy who played barbarously and wonderfully. As piano playing, it was perhaps abominable, but as music, it was something real, vitalized by a sense of rhythm that was stronger than his other physical senses. That not only filled his dark mind, but worried his body incessantly. To hear him, to watch him, was to see a Negro enjoying himself as only a Negro can. It was as if all the agreeable sensations possible to creators of flesh and blood were heaped up on those black and white keys, and he were gloating over them and tricking them through his yellow fingers. In the middle of a crashing waltz, Darnall suddenly began to play softly, and turning to one of the men who stood behind him, whispered, "Somebody dancing in there." He jerked his bullet head toward the dining room. "I hear little feet. Girls, I spect." Anson Kirkpatrick mounted a chair and peeped over the transom. Springing down, he wrenched open the doors and ran out into the dining room. Tiny and Lena, Antonia, and Mary Dusick were waltzing in the middle of the floor. They separated and fled toward the kitchen, giggling. Kirkpatrick caught Tiny by the elbows. "What's the matter with you girls? Dancing out here by yourselves when there's a room full of lonesome men on the other side of the partition? Introduce me to your friends, Tiny." The girls, still laughing, were trying to escape. Tiny looked alarmed. "Mrs. Gardner wouldn't like it," she protested. "She'd be awful mad if you was to come out here and dance with us." "Mrs. Gardner's an Omaha girl. Now you're Lena, are you? And you're Tony and you're Mary. Have I got you all straight?" O'Reilly and the others began to pile the chairs on the tables. Johnny Gardner ran in from the office. "Easy, boys, easy," he entreated them. "You'll wake the cook, and there'll be the devil to pay for me. She won't hear the music, but she'll be down the minute anything's moved in the dining room." "Oh, what do you care, Johnny? Fire the cook and wire Molly to bring another. Come along, nobody'll tell tales." Johnny shook his head. "It's a fact, boys," he said confidentially. "If I take a drink in Black Hawk, Molly knows it in Omaha." His guests laughed and slapped him on the shoulder. "Oh, we'll make it all right with Molly. Get your pack up, Johnny." Molly was Mrs. Gardner's name, of course. Molly Brown was painted in large blue letters on the glossy white side of the hotel bus, and Molly was engraved inside Johnny's ring and on his watch case, doubtless on his heart too. He was an affectionate little man, and he thought his wife a wonderful woman. He knew that without her he would hardly be more than a clerk in some other man's hotel. At a word from Kirkpatrick, Darnall spread himself out over the piano and began to draw the dance music out of it, while the perspiration shone on his short wool and on his uplifted face. He looked like some glistening African god of pleasure, full of strong, savage blood. Whenever the dancers paused to change partners or to catch breath, he would boom out softly, "Who's that going back on me? One of these city gentlemen, I bet. Now you girls, you ain't going to let that floor get cold?" Antonia seemed frightened at first, and kept looking questioningly at Lena and Tiny over Willie O'Reilly's shoulder. Tiny Soderball was trim and slender, with lively little feet and pretty ankles. She wore her dresses very short. She was quicker in speech, lighter in movement and manner than the other girls. Mary Dusick was broad and brown of countenance, slightly marked by smallpox, but handsome for all that. She had beautiful chestnut hair, coils of it. Her forehead was low and smooth, and her commanding dark eyes regarded the world indifferently and fearlessly. She looked bold and resourceful and unscrupulous, and she was all of these. They were handsome girls, had the fresh color of their country upbringing, and in their eyes that brilliancy which is called, by no metaphor, alas, the light of youth. Darren Alt played until his manager came and shut the piano. Before he left to us, he showed us his gold watch, which struck the hours, and a topaz ring given him by some Russian nobleman who delighted in Negro melodies and had heard Darren Alt play in New Orleans. At last he tapped his way upstairs after bowing to everybody, docile and happy. I walked home with Antonia. We were so excited that we dreaded to go to bed. We lingered a long while at the Harlings' gate, whispering in the cold, until the restlessness was slowly chilled out of us. Part 8. The Harling children and I were never happier, never felt more contented and secure than in the weeks of spring which broke that long winter. We were out all day in the thin sunshine, helping Mrs. Harling and Tony break the ground and plant the garden, dig around the orchard trees, tie up the vines, and clip the hedges. Every morning before I was up, I could hear Tony singing in the garden rows. After the apple and cherry trees broke into bloom, we ran about under them, hunting for the new nests the birds were building, throwing clods at each other and playing hide and seek with Nina. Yet the summer, which was to change everything, was coming nearer every day. When boys and girls are growing up, life can't stand still, not even in the quietest of country towns, and they have to grow up whether they will or no. That is what their elders are always forgetting. It must have been in June, for Mrs. Harling and Antonia were preserving cherries, when I stopped one morning to tell them that a dancing pavilion had come to town. I had seen 2 drays hauling the canvas and painted poles up from the depot. That afternoon, 3 cheerful-looking Italians strolled about Black Hawk, looking at everything, and with them was a dark, stout woman who wore a long gold watch chain about her neck and carried a black lace parasol. They seemed especially interested in children and vacant lots. When I overtook them, they stopped to say a word. I found them affable and confiding. They told me they worked in Kansas City in the winter, and in summer they went out among the farming towns with their tent and taught dancing. When business fell off in one place, they moved on to another. The dancing pavilion was set up near the Danish laundry on a vacant lot surrounded by tall, arched cottonwood trees. It was very much like a merry-go-round tent, with open sides and gay flags flying from their poles. Before the week was over, all the ambitious mothers were sending their children to the afternoon dancing class. At 3 o'clock, one met little girls in white dresses and little boys in the round-collared shirts of the time, hurrying along the sidewalk on their way to the tent. Mrs. Fanny received them at the entrance, always dressed in lavender with a great deal of black lace, her important watch chain lying on her bosom. She wore her hair on the top of her head, built up in a black tower with red coral combs. When she smiled, she showed 2 rows of strong, crooked yellow teeth. She taught the little children herself, and her husband, the harpist, taught the older ones. Often the mothers brought their fancy work and sat on the shady side of the tent during the lesson. The popcorn man wheeled his glass wagon under the big cottonwood by the door and lounged in the sun, sure of a good trade when the dancing was over. Mr. Jensen, the Danish laundryman, used to bring a chair from his porch and sit out in the grass plot. Some ragged little boys from the depot sold pop and ice lemonade under a white umbrella at the corner and made faces at the spruce youngsters who came to dance. That vacant lot soon became the most cheerful place in town. Even on the hottest afternoons, the cottonwoods made a rustling shade, and the air smelled of popcorn and melted butter and bouncing bets wilting in the sun. Those hardy flowers had run away from the laundryman's garden, and the grass in the middle of the lot was pink with them. The Vanis kept exemplary order and closed every evening at the hour suggested by the city council. When Mrs. Vanny gave the signal and the harp struck up Home Sweet Home, all Black Hawk knew it was 10 o'clock. You could set your watch by that tune as confidently as by the roundhouse whistle. At last there was something to do in those long, empty summer evenings, when the merry people sat like images on their front porches and the boys and girls tramped and tramped the board sidewalks northward to the edge of the open prairie, south to the depot, and back again to the post office, the ice cream parlor, the butcher shop. Now there was a place where the girls could wear their new dresses and where one could laugh aloud without being reproved by the ensuing silence. That silence seemed to ooze out of the ground, to hang under the foliage of the black maple trees with the bats and shadows. Now it was broken by light-hearted sounds. First, the deep purring of Mr. Vanny's harp came in silvery ripples through the blackness of the dusty-smelling night. Then the violins fell in. One of them was almost like a flute. They called so archly, so seductively, that our feet hurried toward the tent of themselves. Why hadn't we had a tent before? Dancing became popular now, just as roller skating had been the summer before. The Progressive Euchre Club arranged with the Vannys for the exclusive use of the floor on Tuesday and Friday nights. At other times, anyone could dance who paid his money and was orderly. The railroad men, the roundhouse merchants, the delivery boys, the icemen, the farm hands who lived near enough to ride into town after their day's work was over. I never missed a Saturday night dance. The tent was open until midnight then. The country boys came in from the farms 8 and 10 miles away, and all the country girls were on the floor. Antonia and Lena and Tiny, and the Danish laundry girls and their friends. I was not the only boy who found these dances gayer than the others. The young man who belonged to the Progressive Euchre Club used to drop in late and risk a tiff with their sweethearts and general condemnation for a waltz with the hired girls. Part 9. There was a curious social situation in Black Hawk. All the young men felt the attraction of the fine, well-set-up country girls who had come to town to earn a living and, in nearly every case, to help the father struggle out of debt or to make it possible for the younger children of the family to go to school. Those girls had grown up in the first bitter hard times and had got little schooling themselves. But the younger brothers and sisters for whom they had made such sacrifices and who have had advantages never seem to me, when I meet them now, half as interesting or as well educated. The older girls who helped to break up the wild sod learned so much from life, from poverty, from their mothers and grandmothers. They had all, like Antonia, been early awakened and made observant by coming at a tender age from an old country to a new. I can remember a score of these country girls who were in service in Black Hawk during the few years I lived there, and I can remember something unusual and engaging about each of them. Physically, they were almost a race apart, and out-of-door work had given them a vigor which, when they got over their first shyness on coming to town, developed into a positive carriage and freedom of movement, and made them conspicuous among Black Hawk women. That was before the day of high school athletics. Girls who had to walk more than half a mile to school were pitied. There was not a tennis court in the town. Physical exercise was thought rather inelegant for the daughters of well-to-do families. Some of the high school girls were jolly and pretty, but they stayed indoors in winter because of the cold, and in summer because of the heat. When one danced with them, their bodies never moved inside their clothes. Their muscles seemed to ask but one thing: not to be disturbed. I remember those girls merely as faces in the schoolroom, gay and rosy, or listless and dull, cut off below the shoulders like cherubs by the ink-smeared tops of the high desks that were surely put there to make us round-shouldered and hollow-chested. The daughters of Black Hawk merchants had a confident, uninquiring belief that they were refined, and that the country girls who worked out were not. The American farmers in our county were quite as hard pressed as their neighbors from other countries. All alike had come to Nebraska with little capital and no knowledge of the soil they must subdue. All had borrowed money on their land. But no matter in what straits the Pennsylvanian or Virginian found himself, he would not let his daughters go out into service. Unless his girls could teach a country school, they sat at home in poverty. The Bohemian and Scandinavian girls could not get positions as teachers because they had no opportunity to learn the language. Determined to help in the struggle to clear the homestead from debt, they had no alternative but to go into service. Some of them, after they came to town, remained as serious and as discreet in behavior as they had been when they plowed and herded on their father's farm. Others, like the three Bohemian Marys, tried to make up for the years of youth they had lost. But every one of them did what she had set out to do, and sent home those hard-earned dollars. The girls I knew were always helping to pay for plows and reapers, brood sows, or steers to fatten. One result of this family solidarity was that the foreign farmers in our county were the first to become prosperous. After the fathers were out of debt, the daughters married the sons of neighbors, usually of like nationality, and the girls who once worked in Black Hawk kitchens are today managing big farms and fine families of their own. Their children are better off than the children of the town women they used to serve. I thought the attitude of the town people toward these girls very stupid. If I told my schoolmates that Lena Lingard's grandfather was a clergyman and much respected in Norway, they looked at me blankly. What did it matter? All foreigners were ignorant people who couldn't speak English. There was not a man in Black Hawk who had the intelligence or cultivation, much less the personal distinction, of Antonia's father. Yet people saw no difference between her and the three Marys. They were all Bohemians, all hired girls. I always knew I should live long enough to see my country girls come into their own, and I have. Today, the best that a harassed Black Hawk merchant can hope for is to sell provisions and farm machinery and automobiles to the rich farms where that first crop of stalwart Bohemian and Scandinavian girls are now the mistresses. The Black Hawk boys looked forward to marrying Black Hawk girls and living in a brand new little house with best chairs that mustn't not be sat upon and hand-painted china that mustn't not be used. But sometimes a young fellow would look up from his ledger or out through the grating of his father's bank and let his eyes follow Linga Lingard as she passed the window with their slow, undulating walk, or Tiny Soderball tripping by in her short skirt and striped stockings. The country girls were considered a menace to the social order. Their beauty shone out too boldly against a conventional background. But anxious mothers need have felt no alarm. They mistook the mettle of their sons. The respect for respectability was stronger than any desire in Black Hawk youth. Our young man of position was like the son of a royal house. The boy who swept out his office or drove his delivery wagon might frolic with the jolly country girls, but he himself must sit all evening in a plush parlor where conversation dragged so perceptibly that the father often came in and made blundering efforts to warm up the atmosphere. On his way home from his dole call, he would perhaps meet Tony and Lena coming along the sidewalk, whispering to each other, or the three Bohemian Marys in their long plush coats and caps, comporting themselves with a dignity that only made their eventful histories the more piquant. If he went to the hotel to see a traveling man on business, there was Tiny arching her shoulders at him like a kitten. If he went into the laundry to get his collars, there were the four Danish girls smiling up from their ironing boards with their white throats and their pink cheeks. The three Marys were the heroines of a cycle of scandalous stories which the old men were fond of relating as they sat about the cigar stand in the drugstore. Mary Dusick had been a housekeeper for a bachelor rancher from Boston, and after several years in his service, she was forced to retire from the world for a short time. Later, she came back to town to take the place of her friend, Mary Svobodna, who was similarly embarrassed. The three Marys were considered as dangerous as high explosives to have about the kitchen, yet they were such good cooks and such admirable housekeepers that they never had to look for a place. The Vanis's tent brought the town boys and country girls together on neutral ground. Sylvester Lovett, who was cashier in his father's bank, always found his way to the tent on a Saturday night. He took all the dances Lena Lingard would give him, and even grew bold enough to walk home with her. If his sisters or their friends happened to be among the onlookers on popular nights, Sylvester stood back in the shadow under the cottonwood trees, smoking and watching Lena with a harassed expression. Several times I stumbled upon him there in the dark, and I felt rather sorry for him. He reminded me of Ole Benson, who used to sit on the draw side and watch Lena herd her cattle. Later in the summer, when Lena went home for a week to visit her mother, I heard from Antonia the young Lovett drove all the way out there to see her and took her buggy riding. In my ingenuousness, I hoped that Sylvester would marry Lena, and thus give all the country girls a better position in the town. Sylvester dallied about Lena until he began to make mistakes in his work, had to stay at the bank until after dark to make his books balance. He was daft about her, and everyone knew it. To escape from his predicament, he ran away with a widow 6 years older than himself who owned a half section. This remedy worked, apparently. He never looked at Lena again, nor lifted his eyes as he ceremoniously tipped his hat when he happened to meet her on the sidewalk. So that was what they were like, I thought, these white-handed, high-collared clerks and bookkeepers. I used to glare at young Lovett from a distance, and only wished I had some way of showing my contempt for him. Part 10. It was at the Vanis's tent that Antonia was discovered. Hitherto she had been looked upon more as a ward of the Harlings than as one of the hired girls. She had lived in their house and yard and garden. Her thoughts never seemed to stray outside that little kingdom. But after the tent came to town, she began to go about with Tiny and Lena and their friends. The Vannies often said that Antonia was the best dancer of them all. I sometimes heard murmurs in the crowd outside the pavilion that Mrs. Harling would soon have her hands full with that girl. The young men began to joke with each other about the Harlings' Tony, as they did about the Marshalls' Anna or the gardener's Tiny. Antonia talked and thought of nothing but the tent. She hummed the dance tunes all day. When supper was late, she hurried with her dishes, dropped and smashed them in her excitement. At the first call of the music, she became irresponsible. If she hadn't time to dress, she nearly flung off her apron and shot out of the kitchen door. Sometimes I went with her. The moment the lighted tent came into view, she would break into a run like a boy. There were always partners waiting for her. She began to dance before she got her breath. Antonia's success at the tent had its consequences. The iceman lingered too long now when he came into the covered porch to fill the refrigerator. The delivery boys hung about the kitchen when they brought the groceries. Young farmers who were in town for Saturday came tramping through the yard to the back door to engage dances or to invite Tony to the parties and picnics. Lena and Norwegian Anna dropped in to help her with her work so that she could get away early. The boys who brought her home after the dances sometimes laughed at the black gate and wakened Mr. Harling from his first sleep. A crisis was inevitable. One Saturday night, Mr. Harling had gone down to the cellar for beer. As he came up the stairs in the dark, he heard scuffling on the back porch and then the sound of a vigorous slap. He looked out through the side door in time to see a pair of long legs vaulting over the picket fence. Antonia was standing there, angry and excited. Young Harry Payne, who was to marry his employer's daughter on Monday, had come to the tent with a crowd of friends and danced all evening. Afterward, he begged Antonia to let him walk home with her. She said she supposed he was a nice young man, as he was one of Miss Frances's friends, and she didn't mind. On the back porch he tried to kiss her, and when she protested, because he was going to be married on Monday, he caught her and kissed her until she got one hand free and slapped him. Mr. Harling put his beer bottles down on the table. "This is what I've been expecting, Antonia. You've been going with girls who have a reputation for being free and easy, and now you've got the same reputation. I won't have this, and that fellow tramping about my backyard all the time. This is the end of it. Tonight, it stops short. You can quit going to these dances, or you can hunt another place. Yeah, think it over." The next morning, when Mrs. Harling and Frances tried to reason with Antonia, they found her agitated but determined. "Stop going to the tent?" she panted. I wouldn't think of it for a minute. My own father couldn't make me stop. Mr. Harling ain't my boss outside my work. I won't give up my friends either. The boys I go with are nice fellows. I thought Mr. Payne was all right, too, because he used to come here. I guess I gave him a red face for his wedding, all right," she blazed out indignantly. "You'll have to do one thing or the other, Antonia," Mrs. Harling told her decidedly. "I can't go back on what Mr. Harling has said. This is his house." "Then I'll just leave, Mrs. Harling. Lena's been wanting me to get the place closer to her for a long while. Mary Svoboda's going away from the Cathers to work at the hotel, and I can have her place." Mrs. Harling rose from her chair. "Antonia, if you go to the Cutters to work, you cannot come back to this house again. You know what that man is. It will be the ruin of you." Tony snatched up the tea kettle and began to pour boiling water over the glasses, laughing excitedly. "Oh, I can take care of myself. I'm a lot stronger than Cutter is. They pay $4 there, and there's no children. The work's nothing. I can have every evening and be out a lot in the afternoons." "I thought you liked children. Tony, what's come over you?" "I don't know. Something has." Antonia tossed her head and set her jaw. "A girl like me has got to take her good times when she can. Maybe there won't be any tent next year. I guess I want to have my fling, like other girls." Mrs. Harling gave a short, harsh laugh. "If you go to work for the Cutters, you're likely to have a fling that you won't get up from in a hurry. Frances said when she told her grandmother and me about this scene that every pan and plate and cup on the shelves trembled when her mother walked out of the kitchen. Mrs. Harling declared bitterly that she wished she had never let herself get fond of Antonia. Part 11. Willa Cather was the moneylender who had fleeced poor Russian Peter. When a farmer once got into the habit of going to Cather, it was like gambling or the lottery. In an hour of discouragement, he went back. Cather's first name was Wycliffe, and he liked to talk about his pious upbringing. He contributed regularly to the Protestant churches, for sentiment's sake, as he said with a flourish of the hand. He came from a town in Iowa where there were a great many Swedes and could speak a little Swedish, which gave him a great advantage with the early Scandinavian settlers. In every frontier settlement there are men who have come there to escape restraint. Cather was one of the fast set of Black Hawk businessmen. He was an inveterate gambler, though a poor loser. When we saw a light burning in his office late at night, we knew that a game of poker was going on. Cather boasted that he never drank anything stronger than sherry, and he said he got his start in life by saving the money that other young men spent for cigars. He was full of moral maxims for boys. When he came to our house on business, he quoted Poor Richard's Almanac to me and told me he was delighted to find a town boy who could milk a cow. He was particularly affable to grandmother, and whenever they met, he would begin at once to talk about the good old times and simple living. I detested his pink bald head and his yellow whiskers, always soft and glistening.